Bill is currently a founder and managing partner at Urban Ovation. I suggest we leave the ovation till the end of his presentation to see if he's earned it. But this new business of his is focused as a global network community. In LinkedIn, it said it's for veterans. You might explain that. And Bill describes himself as an urban visionary and strategist. There you go. Bill has an awful lot of experience, not only as CEO in Europe for ICSC, Shopping Centre Council, and ULI. Before that, very much business focused at both IBM and Disney. It's a great pleasure for me to welcome Bill to introduce the next panel and run the next session. Bill, please. Right.
The panel on stage, so while I'm saying a few introductory remarks, and the ovation is not for me, Roger. The ovation is for urban, for place. And the concept is, in an increasingly virtual world, it's important that we as an industry recognize our role in creating great places. And so it's two things. It's one, it's a combination of urban, or place, and two, innovation, and lastly, celebration. How do we celebrate great places? And I can't think of two greater places than Lisbon and Porto, which, to the comments from both Antonio and Roger, I've been coming to for probably 30 years. I know I sound like this, but I am 30 years in Europe, Paris and London. I've had the chance to look at a lot of your competitor cities around Europe, and I can tell you, from what I've heard today, and especially yesterday, these two cities are well positioned to continue their extraordinary success of the past couple of years. But that said, and I'm not surprised that the last two panelists were great promoters for their respective cities. I was impressed, Rui, that your focus on talent, people. When I worked for IBM, that was the foremost thing we cared about. Housing, transportation, all that other stuff. When we made location decisions, it was what was the quality of talent. So I would encourage you all, while we all are focused on creating great places, think about people. And I'm honored, Gilberto, are you here? Gilberto Jordan, who many of you know, kindly invited me to serve on the advisory board of ISEG, the Lisbon School of Business and Economics. And they recognize that if Lisbon is going to be competitive, they need to better understand how to promote the capabilities and talent in the city. And I just heard that Porto has seized on that as well. So our job is not to continue, although I think my panelists are all very much promoters of both cities. They also understand the challenges firsthand, some of which I heard in my conversations yesterday. And I encourage you all to be candid, provocative, to be at the same time constructive. How can we collectively help Lisbon and Oporto be even more successful? But don't hold back. If you have, when we go through the discussion, if you have a reaction to what you just heard from Rui and Joanna, if you have thoughts of what they need to do to be more competitive, please share that, because that's what I think they're here to hear from us. And as Roger said, we hope to have a few minutes at the end to invite questions, not just about the first two presentations, but also about anything you hear from this illustrious panel. So I'm going to let them each say a couple of words about who they are, the perspective they bring, their investments or position in both cities, before we get into a series of questions. So I'll go in the order you see on stage. Let's start with you, Fernando. Grab the mic. It seems to work.
Yep. Hi, good morning. First of all, thank you very much on behalf of Square Asset Management to have us in this panel. My name is Fernando Ferreira. I head the investment team at Square. We are a local fund manager, which is now growing to Iberia, and we manage around 1.3 billion euros of real estate.
Hello, nice to be here. Normally, when I have a microphone, I sing. I'm not going to do it now. My name is Pedro Seabra. I've worked all my life in real estate when I'm not singing. And I've worked for many years in the CBRE that I had it for 25 years in Portugal, and for the last decade I've been working as an investor and asset manager in exploring investments. So I've been working in both cities, much more in Lisbon than in Oporto, but I related to Oporto all my life also. Lovely cities and that I love and that are both today in a fantastic position.
So my name is Gilles Lemont. I'm head of real estate for Grupo AGES Portugal, which is a group of insurance here in Portugal, the second in size. So we are here as occupier because we have just finished our new headquarters in Lisbon and Porto, but we are also here as investor in real estate in both cities.
All right, my name is Luís Mota Duarte. I'm CFO of Sonai Sierra, and I'm also the head of investment management for Sonai Sierra. And firstly, thank you very much for the invitation to be here. And when you ask a Latin to talk about the things he likes, it's going to take a bit of time, so we need to watch the clock a bit. Just to say, Sonai Sierra, we are today a lot more than I think what most people know us for. People know us for our shopping center portfolio, but today we manage 6 billion euros of real estate across 11 countries at this point in time. Out of that 6 billion, 1.4 billion is outside of shopping centers. We manage offices, residential, we manage logistics, and also mixed-use developments. And we are here as operators, we're here as developers, we're here as investment managers, because we are actively investing in Porto at the moment. We're also actively investing in Lisbon. And are very happy to share our views as to how we see these cities and the investment in Portugal.
Well, those were surprisingly modest summaries. I did a little homework and looked at their LinkedIn and company profiles, and they are some of the dominant players, as you all know better than I, in both these markets. But I want to have the audience introduce yourselves in one simple survey. How many of you are primarily or exclusively investors, developers, players in Lisbon? How many from Porto or in Porto? So there's a slight Lisbon bias. How many in both? You would say equally balanced. So you're, in a sense, we're going to be preaching to the converted because most of you understand the strengths and weaknesses of both markets. How many here from outside of Portugal? Not very many, but it'll be interesting to see if you convince them in the next 31 minutes. So I'd like to go a little bit off-piste in the questions that we were kindly sent by the organizer and ask you each to comment a little bit on what do you see as the primary challenges in each of the two markets. What do you see as the barriers to be even better, to grow faster, to attract more investors? So we'll go in the same order, unless somebody wants to volunteer to go first. Fernando.
And it's the second time that Pedro has a microphone and hasn't sung, so it's going well. I think the last slide on Lisbon, I think that's the main focus. I think there's a lot of comments from many investors about, and Joanna said very well, time is money, a lot of uncertainty, and this blocks a lot of appetite from investors that wants to step into Portugal and wants to, especially to invest in Lisbon. I think in relation to Porto, Porto has been doing a great job, for sure. I think Porto is now spoken in many events like this one across the world because there's acknowledgement of Porto today that it wasn't available 10 years ago. It's impressive to see the number of unicorns that decided to start in Porto or to move to Porto. And the biggest problem that Porto has is the perception from many international investors, which by the case, it's not our case, about Porto being very small and not being such a liquid market in terms of investment on the exit. So many investment has been made. And when we look at in the last years in Porto, there's been a lot of capital coming to Porto, more on the private equity, but already some core investors, long-term, and I'm speaking about international capital. But many investors, the question is, when we turn the building around and we want to exit from the building, who's the buyers for that market, for that product? And that's one of the biggest challenges that Porto has.
to add on the same?
If you have the same opinion, you can say I agree and move on.
No, I think that just to comment on one thing. Of course, we've seen in this conference the potential that we have in this country for all these new kind of residential with management in many different ways. Florida of Europe, and for students, for co-living, etc. And for that, we do need both municipalities probably to get a modernization view on being very, very flexible to adapt to new concepts that may be completely different from what we've been used and all the rules say, and must be very fast adapting to those new concepts and making life easy to the ones that want to do it. And that's basically a big task, but it's an important one for both cities.
Gilles?
Yes, I would like to insist on two topics. First, so when we look at Portugal globally, if I try to compare that with other countries, actually, if you compare and to try to position Lisbon and Porto together, is it the same as in France? Definitely not. In France, you have Paris, and then you have, say, secondary cities like Lyon, Toulouse, and things like this. So, like in the UK, it's completely different. Is it like in Germany, like you have top 5 to 6 cities? No, because it's not, the dimension of a city is different. Is it like in the Netherlands, when you have a Randstad, we have Amsterdam, Den Haag, Rotterdam, working together, actually, same type of profile, but really, really well connected, and really vending themselves on the market altogether. And actually, the more I think about this, the more I think Portugal is a little bit similar, should be a little bit similar story as the Netherlands. So, 2 major city, hub, but as of today, not enough connected. This would help a lot to be more connected. But this is the first important topic, I think. So, working as a team together, and I think it's really, really important for the country. Second aspect, it is really to tell, it's a real estate summit. Real estate which are real. So insist on the real city, what are the current projects, what are the municipalities developing in terms of public transportation, show what the development of metro here, show what you do in the public spaces, show what public investment are in new buildings. This is really key, and this is really helping international investors to understand the story and to move further with their own investment. And I will not say anything about the process of licensing, because the developers are going to tell that.
Before we move on to Luis, I want to add a couple of cities to your comparison, because I grew up in Los Angeles, or near Los Angeles. And for those of you who know, there's a great rivalry between LA and San Francisco. And it's a similar dynamic. One is much larger. One is more cultural, higher quality of life, and I think you know which one I'm talking about. But, you know, they have for years, since I can remember, tried to figure out how they can promote, even though they're much further apart, how they can promote the synergy between the 2 cities. So I think you made a great point, that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. And trying to create a story that's about Portugal and about these 2 great, very different cities will be key to both your success. Luis.
Sure, just a quick one on Porto, because we sometimes look at Porto as a secondary city. And I think I'm not from Porto, and I live in Porto, and I joined Porto 8 years ago. And my view of Porto is that Porto is a bit like having children. You only know how it feels once you've been through it. And Porto is like, if you live there, if you work there, it's it's really primary and a capital city, I would say, in that sense. Coming back to Porto and Lisbon, I mean, there are always things which can be improved in terms of the way to do business in Porto and Lisbon, what the municipalities can do. But it's very encouraging to see that we have very professional, let's call it management teams in the municipalities that are really driving investment forward. What I would like to say, though, is when we look at Portugal overall, and when we look at the future that we will face, which we discussed yesterday at length, is challenging, is going to be difficult. In that sense, Portugal is no different from other countries. We will have challenging macro conditions, but everyone that has capital available, and that's what we currently go through, is when we think about capital allocation, we try to identify the cities and the countries where we can invest, i.e. the cities and countries that in the current market conditions are relatively better than other markets. And there might be a bias, of course, I do recognize it, but Lisbon and Porto, or Portugal overall, are very well placed compared to other markets from a resilience point of view, but also because we have very specific structural drivers that lead to a better performance, I would say. And I think one can summarize those in 5 points mainly. Thinking about the impacts of the war and impacts of COVID. I mean, you all know this, and I'm the last panelist on the last day at on the last panel of the conference, so I will probably not say anything new. But the impacts of the war, in theory, in Portugal, should be lower than they are elsewhere. We have very little economic dependence on Russia. We have almost any energy dependence on Russia. And we are a market where we have many more renewable energy sources than other markets do. 30% of our energy comes from renewable sources and not from fossil fuels. Having said that, and I'm going to be very careful in the way I put it, unfortunately to a certain extent, there are some dynamics that the war brings to Portugal that actually favor Portugal to a certain extent. If we think about nearshoring, the amount of companies that are coming to Portugal, that are investing in Portugal, not only logistics and offices, etc. Tourism is much more significant. Even the attention of capital investors moving from the east to the west. So there are many different elements where the war, to a certain extent, is impacts less negatively Portugal than it does other countries. So from that point of view, it is favorable. If you look at the second one, and being very honest, Portugal is a, let's say, a more emerging or less mature country than most other European markets, which implies it's very fragmented. There is some lack of sophistication sometimes, but there's also much less information. That means if you have boots on the ground, you can actually identify a lot more opportunities that you find elsewhere, because there's just much more inefficiency. And again, you don't find that in many countries, but you can find that definitely in Porto and in Lisbon. I heard someone yesterday say that tourists like to go to the restaurants where the locals go. And I think real estate investment should be to a certain extent the same. Real estate that is so dependent on the actual micro location. So a foreign investor going where the locals go is probably the right point of advice. And the locals, and please don't take this as arrogance, I'm relatively new to the real estate sector, so it's definitely not my credit. But if we look at the locals, Portuguese asset managers, property developers, anyone related to real estate, if someone knows how it is to deal with a deep crisis or the deepest crisis in our history, it's the Portuguese real estate players that have went through a very difficult crisis in 2008 to 14 and are where we are today, where everyone should be very proud of what we have achieved. The problem in Portugal is the availability of capital. It's not a wealthy country, and with not a lot of wealth. And that's now being compensated with international capital coming to Portugal and investing. And that's really compensating and really boosting the local know-how that we have. I have 2 more points, sorry for the lengthy answer. If we then look at wider macro conditions, and a lot of it has been said, but if we look at supply and demand, supply in Portugal has been poor. Has been poor because of the lack of capital, because we are conservative in our nature, and sometimes because laws, regulations haven't necessarily helped. So our stock, whilst the average age of the buildings is not older but actually newer than it is in other countries in Europe, the quality of the stock is of lower quality because of lack of investment, lack of modernization. Again, that's opportunity. But if we look at supply and thinking about supply overall, I mean, every area of possible supply has been increasing in Portugal and has continued structural drivers to continue to increase. If we look at domestic demand, this has been said yesterday, corporates at the lowest leverage they have been for a while, individuals at the highest savings ratios they have been for a while. If we look at tourism, this summer was probably, or it was, the best summer that the hotel industry has had in Portugal. That is going to be structural, that is going to continue. If we look at corporate demand, I was talking earlier to a gentleman from CBRE who was telling me that in Porto, 90% of office space is being occupied by new tenants, by new corporates coming to Porto, mostly international. That's the same in Lisbon. Working from home. Lisbon and Porto win all the awards for the best places to work from home. If we look at student demand, international students are increasingly represent a higher percentage of students in Portugal. That is going to continue. Infrastructure, very basic at this moment. Yes, there is a lot of a significant pipeline, but the overall infrastructure is still relatively basic. And last but not least, but if we look at housing, you all know better than me, I mean, the lack of supply that there is for the current demand for housing. And not only the domestic demand, but mostly international demand. I think 30% of houses sold in in Lisbon, almost the same, were to international investors. And that's a huge number. And that is a whole new market, which we never had. And that's also something to bear in mind. When we look at the traditional affordability ratios to assess housing, the housing market, we need to bear in mind that some people that are investing here are people that compare Lisbon, Porto to Madrid, to Paris, and look at relative prices. The last point, this is a point that is close to our heart, and sorry if there's a bit of a bias here. Valuations. Yesterday someone said that yields will increase. I cannot, of course, debate the strength of the logical argument. It's a logical argument. If interest rates increase, yields will increase. But it's also important to say that the starting point of where yields are needs to be taken into account. And risk-return profile needs to be taken into account. And let me go to the example, which is going to be probably not the most popular sector at the moment, but shopping centers. We have a lot of them, so I'm probably going to be biased, but I speak with knowledge of how it is performing at the moment. Shopping centers. In the past, over the last few years, the only sector in Portugal, and I think Iberia, where yields actually increased. Everywhere else, it decreased. But if they increased, that means that the risk profile, the embedded risk profile, is higher for Portuguese shopping centers than it is for other asset classes and in other countries. Because yields in Portugal are again higher than they are elsewhere. But then let's look at the market. The structure of the market, the structure of the shopping center market in Portugal. The number I like most is that the space of shopping centers in the US that would have to reduce for the US to have the same shopping center square meters per capita that we have in Portugal is 83%. So 83% of the shopping centers in the US should close for the US to have the same penetration that we do. That itself is huge. And sometimes we extrapolate easily from the US to Portugal. No relationship. Sorry, I'll be quick. But I need to say this about shopping centers. Secondly, when we, you lost my line of thought now, apologies. But when we think about shopping centers, high street retail, massive in the UK, massive in the US, very low in Portugal. So the structure of the market is very different. And if we look at performance of shopping centers today, Francisco showed a chart yesterday. I'm sorry I don't have the Sierra chart, but it's a very good chart where our shopping centers today are all trading at double-digit performance above 2019 or at high single-digit. So long story, okay. Sorry, just to say that Portugal presents structurally very attractive dynamics. Our risk-return profile, because here the assets do still trade at a discount. I'm getting a lot of hand.
Luis.
Shut up.
Yeah.
I will try. just to say, there are very strong rational arguments as to why investing in Portugal and Porto at Lisbon are very strong from a factual point of view and even without any subjective assessments to it.
Okay. Well, you just used up your entire allocation. I had 5 other questions for you. But that was a fantastic overview and a proof that none of you really answered the question. You're all diplomats and you were very balanced in your responses in terms of discussing the specific challenges that need to be addressed to make either or both markets more attractive. But I would like to kind of move on and ask each of you to comment on what you heard from our 2 opening presentations. Was there anything there, because you know both the markets better certainly than I do and probably many in the audience, that you felt was overly optimistic, promotional, spin, marketing, I mean, what's the truth? If you have, I mean, this is your chance to be a bit provocative. And again, in the spirit of being constructive, we're trying to help them attract even more investment, more jobs, more talent to their various markets. So if you could critique kindly our two opening speakers, do you have any advice for them? Fernando.
Okay, so I think that on our side, and I cannot take this personally, I need to take this as heading the investment team of Square. And sorry again to go through the situation of the licensing. I think that's the point. And what, looking to the presentation, I think it's very encouraging to see Joanna referring, this is the situation, this is how we're handling it. So I think the only critique we can do now, or I can do now, is that if in 1 year we are here, or why not in Porto, because this is the Portugal Real Estate Summit, and we might be in a different position than we are today. So Joanna, we are with you. We trust that you're going to take us in the right direction. I think with Porto, to be honest, and Bill, just probably also to give you some headlines. Porto, and don't get me wrong, in 2013, on the investment side, it was close to nothing in terms of the appetite of investors to step into Porto. So when we look in the last 8 years, what happened, the fact that we already have information on the office market, because back in 2012, 2013, there wasn't so much information about the office market in Porto because there wasn't such thing as office market in Porto. I think there's been a lot of work being done to put Porto in the map. It's from the presentation that I saw, to be honest, it's more about some of the what Investport is doing in terms of how they support the investors. I think it would be interesting to learn more on what that really means, or if it's just a marketing tool. I think that's the only comment I might have.
Well, interestingly, I had a conversation last night with somebody who's investing in both cities, and he made the case for Porto, and that a lot of what you said, Rui, in terms of treating investors as a customer, an almost commercial approach, and after-sales management, making sure they stay happy and attract others, I found very compelling. And Joanna, you preempted his critique of Lisbon because he said it's just much, much harder to get things done here. And you obviously recognize that, and I think to your credit. Pedro.
It's a continuation of this. I think that when we talk about the office market, we have completely different situations in both cities. Lisbon is a consolidated office market for many years with millions of euros of transactions each single year, with 200,000 of space occupied each single year. And in Lisbon, we always had the headquarters of the multinationals. Well, the world changed. 10 years ago, we will have the finance companies occupying the best buildings. Now it's lawyers occupying the best buildings, and the finance companies go to the outskirts. But having that change, it is a big consolidated office market. Porto didn't exist as an office market some years ago. The traditional big players in Porto, the Sonais or Iberian groups, etc., have always stayed in the factories and never occupied space in the center. There was never a central business district. But in the last decade, and especially in the last years, it is a very, very attractive new market. You can see that the offices, you don't really see where is the central business district, but you see that align with the metro line, you have new developments, and there are amazing things. To say that we are a country, for example, POP, that was developed, that was designed by those beautiful architects that are there from Lisbon, probably Melian, but it's an example. But other examples like Leonesa, for example, are fantastic examples of something that is happening in Porto that is very attractive. And now Farfetch, the new headquarters of Farfetch, for example. So we have in Porto we don't have the headquarters of the multinational insurance companies, banks, etc., but we now have an attractiveness for technology that is outstanding. Some insurance companies. The best insurance companies are there, I would say.
So Gilles, just going a
So
little...
I think that just what should be done is to continue what is being done, because it's being well done, and I'm happy with we are in good hands in both cities, I believe, and people is doing the best that they can, and I think that we should continue on the road that we are, because it's a good road.
Okay. Again, always the diplomat. Gilles, I want to just not the same exact question, because you have just built headquarters in both cities, and as a fellow recovering architect, and this is not just about the buildings, but it's about the importance of the urban setting, the fabric, the place. I'm interested in your commentary, not in your current job, but as a trained architect, how you see the importance of place, both the individual building and the context those buildings are in. And is there a difference between the two cities?
Yes, there is. Okay.
Okay.
Okay. So I think, to me, buildings are important. Architecture is very important, of course. It's part of image. It's part of the attractivity of a company, and for investors also. What is perhaps more important, it's actually how building a project like we have in Porto with Severia, or here in Lisbon, in Parque das Nações. It is how this type of project transforms the city, create a new place in the city. And here, I think you see the difference between both cities. Like you see Parque das Nações, where we are finishing part of the development of Parque das Nações, which is really an example, I would say, in the world, because it's really fantastic what has been done there. It should be really shown everywhere internationally, because it is really something spectacular with different, with residential, with shopping center, with offices, with integration of services. It's really a fantastic example, and we are very proud to be part of that story, so we are continuing a story. Porto, it's a different story, because as Pedro said, it's a little bit chaotic, actually. Whereas a business district, when you show where you should put your offices in Porto, it's not obvious at all. And so what we did also with Severia in Porto is to create a place which was nearly in the middle of nowhere. And tomorrow we have our own office, the second office building, there's a residential project. Things are moving around. Since the first day, when we discussed with the developer, we spoke first, what about mobility? So mobility is quite key. So it's quite key for the municipality to participate to the mobility. Of course, the municipality has to improve the licensing process, and Porto is going better than in Lisbon. But the role of a municipality is also to have a clear view about mobility and to facilitate. And if a municipality is creating a good mobility, we will automatically create good development.
Yeah.
That's a little bit the difference.
Yes, Pedro, you wanted to add something.
I just think that the biggest need that we have to change is mentalities. What I say when I say that, we have here people that are leading and saying that investors are welcomed. But unfortunately, in this country, at the middle level of these entities, the investors are not welcomed. And that is the big difference that we have to work out. Because I understand everybody in this room wants to go in the same direction. But we have a lot of difficulty to deal with people that is not in this room and doesn't think like us. And that is the main problem that have to be dealt with. Very difficult one to deal with, but that is the main problem.
Well, I don't know if the expression misery loves company, but that issue for us as an industry, how we're perceived of by the public. For all the good we think we do, there's a large percentage of the public that thinks we're disruptive, we're greedy, we are somewhere below politicians in the ranking of... So, you know, changing the narrative, changing the perception of the property industry is a challenge around the world.
And some of these people is working in places that really create a problem to the people that wants to do things.
Exactly. So we have 7 seconds above 5 minutes, and I wanted to open it up for some questions as promised. But Luis, you have 10 seconds if you want to add anything to what's been said on the last questions before we open it up.
No, just to say to the municipalities, you have such a great raw materials in Lisbon and in Porto. There is unfortunately a lot of legacy, but the quality is so good that most of it is just creating the trust and the transparency with international investors, and which they're doing and doing well and just stronger and louder and in less time than I did.
Well, you know, I did also want to comment back to your point, Gilles, as a fellow once architect, and the comparison I made earlier between Los Angeles and San Francisco. Both Lisbon and Porto are constrained by history and geography. So the availability of development sites, and it forces you to create, as you've done in Porto, new satellite nodes. You can't go to the center of either city or anywhere near the center and do anything of real significance because of those constraints. And that's a challenge faced by many of the historic European cities. So, we have a microphone and obviously a question.
Does it work?
And by the way, again, to remind you, it can also be for Joanna and Rui,
Yep.
or for anyone on the panel.
Hi, some of you know me. I'm Volkert. I manage the real estate book of Novo Banco. I guess if you were going to ask for blunt and unpleasant questions, that's probably the reason why Antonio didn't invite me to the panel this year. But I'm still gonna take that opportunity. So I guess the big elephant in the room is, and we've just touched it on the fringes, is licensing. And we've had the opportunity to endure this situation. I think in Porto it has worked extremely well, and then probably the consensus that it is a lot better than in Lisbon. I hear that Joanna saying, and I've heard her many times saying, oh, time is of the essence and time is money, and yes, and it's, we welcome that message, but what I miss is, what are you going to do to change it? So, is there any...
While you hand her the microphone.
I've seen another presentation of yours where you went into the details of what you were doing, and I think it's constructive that the people understand that you in fact have a plan and that you're doing something. And I think it's a missed opportunity to show what you're actually doing. And maybe also the panel wants to give her some advice of what we think might be done.
Joanna.
Let me just say one thing. The briefing was my fault, and I ask the city of Lisbon, please don't do a speech about licensing, because we want this conference to be more than licensing. So before Joanna takes the answer, I must claim my credits, and the blame for the briefing not be licensing is mine. Joanna.
Can I? Yes. Yeah. So, answering your question, it's a good one, the most important one. I can explain it in 4 words. Celerity, communication, clarity, and transparency. And when we arrived, so we are in Lisbon municipality almost in a year, so we need time. We need time to show good results, but we have already good results. We are changing all the workflows, we are optimizing the chain of decision, we are clarifying some rules of the municipal plan that usually are not clear, talking about green areas, talking about how some rules about the buildings. We are working in those clarifying those rules, and we are clarifying procedures. As you can imagine, we have 70% of the persons who enter in the licensing go back, and then in the architecture approval, 90% go back. So there is a problem of clarification and communication. We are changing all that all that kind of procedures.
Well,
And just to finish, the kind of project manager that I told you before, we are creating a team of project managers, and we are going to do, not this year, only next year, the developer can go to an app and see what is going with the process. Not when we arrived to the municipality, we didn't have any data. We are creating the data. So I don't know.
well, that's very encouraging, and I also think that it's not entirely in your hands from what I've heard over the last couple of days. You have constituents and voters who seem highly fragmented, and there's some on the fringe who don't want NIMBYs, as we call them. So I don't know if that challenge is worse in Lisbon than it is in Porto, but you have that in addition. I've been given, is it true, did I read you right, a 5-minute extension? So we have time for maybe 2 or 3 more questions. Margarita.
Yeah. I have a question that I don't know if is more for the gentlemen in the panel or for the Porto municipality. So I understood what we were talking about Porto, because we have been involved in some jobs, big office buildings in Porto. And you are right, it's not very easy to decide where. And in the case that we were involved, and I think is the mobility in a way was the driver, easy access to transportation, easy access to 100 meters from a tube, a metro station. So my question is, that is, is the location, or is the location versus mobility a possibility, or is a new urban regenerated area with a mixed use place being a better place? And to add to Joana, it is for 25 years is the first time that we have the municipality visiting a project that they have been involved to approve. And that is something that I like to see recently in your department, Joana.
So those were actually 3 questions. And if the panel, Antonio signaling somebody who's not
Maybe
on.
I can add another question. I thought it was amazing to see Porto going to Expo Real together with Matosinhos and Gaia. So congratulations for that. And for years, I've been thinking, why doesn't Lisbon do the same? I mean, Lisbon is a rather small city. It's a 500,000 inhabitant city. And if you look to the greater metropolitan area, this is 2.8 million people and 17 cities. I mean, why are not we joining forces as the greater metropolitan area and go to these events and promote the city and take the same example, good example of Porto?
Great point. So I think maybe that's a question for you, Joanna, but the first question from Margarita, or questions, quick, short answers. Any response to, if you can remember Margarita's questions about transportation, mobility? Any thoughts? Going. There we go.
It's obvious that it's crucial. So mobility is the main point. So if I can give an advice to Porto, so why don't you show your project of extension of metro? Should be first point of your presentation. When you choose for location, it's the first point you are looking. And by the way, if you look at ESG, which is another topic which is quite important for all investors today, if you go more in detail, you want a certification. BREEAM, for instance. Okay, if you are close to the metro station, okay, you cannot avoid to have an excellent, actually. So it's very key. One topic, perhaps about location, urban development and things like this. One question to me at this point in time, which is particularly important for Porto, I think, it's the quality of the stock. You spoke about the quality of the stock, which is relatively poor, of offices, especially in Porto. On the other hand, you have the challenge of ESG and carbon neutral. and we cannot afford just to build new buildings. So
That's
we
absolutely
need to reuse old properties, and this is perhaps a challenge. And so how to position yourself as an investor, as a municipality, with a new use of existing properties, I think it's really a challenge for all of us on the development side, on the investor side, but also on the municipality
So
side.
in the interest of just giving Joanna a chance to say why she's not at Expo, I think we're running out of time.
Just
even our
a short
extension.
sentence, Francisco. We are defining our strategy, how we are going to participate in this kind of events. Please give us some time, okay?
Yeah, we could put metro line on the presentation, but it was a short time. Just to say that about the question of location or mobility, we just opened the terminal intermodal de Campanhã. That is a very strong bet on the oriental side of the city, where we have Matador project. And I think it's a combination of both of them. The Rose line is under construction. I think that will improve mobility. But of course, it's a mix of both. But we are trying with the oriental development of Campanhã to ease the pressure on this historical center of the Porto and to have a more diverse city in terms of pressure, in terms of construction and movement of people and so on. So it's a mix of both. And I will put the new map of Metro in the next presentation. Thank you.
Okay.
Just to say
So,
to Square Asset Management, you provoked me in a good way about if it's marketing or not. I can tell you that there are people in the room that are clients of Investport. So I ask you to talk not with me, but with them. They can tell you what Investport if it's our approach is a client approach. When someone comes to us, we see that as a client. And we do everything that is on our range to satisfy the client.
okay.
Inside the municipality service.
Time for the ovation, not for me, Roger, but for this fantastic panel. Thank you again, and Roger, over to you.